Hello everyone again, and you are all welcome. My name is Sümeyye Karabacak. I'm the master student at the Kadir Has University in the Department of Economics, as you know. I will be moderating this live seminar, as you know, again. This is our fifth of Yeşil seminar series. Today's title will be Sustainable Central Banking at a Crossroad Between Environmental Risks and Alignment Goals. And our presenters today are Ulrich Volz and Simon Dikau. Before we begin, again, I would like to remind you some notes. Today's seminar is being recorded to be available for viewing post-conference. And also, at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. If you have any question before the Q&A session, you can use the chat box to asking your questions. Or after presentation, maybe you can raise your hand and ask your questions to our presenters directly. So now let's me introduce our presenters today. Ulrich Volz is a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS, University of London. He is also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Also, he has served for many international institutions and organizations. And our second guest is Simon Dikau. Dikau is a professor officer at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics again. And Simon also has worked for international think tanks and with central banks. And as I know, Ulrich and Simon will make a joint presentation today. And if they are okay, if you are okay, floor is yours. You can start, actually, Simon and Ulrich.
Yes, thank you so much. I will share my screen. There we go. Yeah, okay. Yes, no, thank you so much for having us. Yeah, great pleasure to be here and to talk to you about the sustainable dimension of central banking and financial supervision. And also a big thank you to ESGI for inviting us and for the university and the institute for hosting us. Yeah, ESGI and I did our PhD together at SOAS, and ESGI always played this role of hosting events and webinars and facilitating exchange. ESGI, I remember the IIPPE webinars or actually in-person seminars that you hosted. So yes, many thanks for inviting us. So what are we talking about today? So generally, the issue is that climate change and environmental degradation have increasingly material impacts on the economy. And at the same time, the environment is affected by unsustainable economic activities. Environmental degradation is a source of more extreme and disruptive natural disasters. This is the physical risk or the physical risk dimension, and addressing this degradation and mitigating the impacts through net zero greenhouse gas emission targets or reducing nature loss are central policy goals. And this is the transition policy or transition risk dimension. So the physical impacts have implications the physical impacts as well as the transition policies have implications for economic activities. Physical events and transition policies affect businesses and entire sectors. Then there is a dependency of firms on nature and ecosystem services. And then there's also an impact of firms on climate and the environment. And this, of course, has financial implications. So banks fund the activities that are affected by physical events, and banks fund activities that have a negative impact on the environment. And yes, so with this, with this slide, I just want to illustrate this. So the question is, how relevant is all of this for central banks and supervisors? And this figure is taken from a recent report that we published together with the NGFS, the networks of central banks and supervisors, exploring this broader environment, ecosystem services and central banking nexus. So the idea is that at the highest level, central banks here on the left oversee the financial system and institutions. Financial institutions finance economic activities and invest in companies. and then companies' activities depend on and impact the environment and ecosystem services. And this creates a transmission channel that connects financial policy through the system to nature and the environment. And the important takeaway from this slide is essentially also this double materiality relationship, that first there is an impact of environmental degradation on firms' balance sheets or on the economy and on the funding financial institutions. And second, there is an impact of firms' activities on the environment and therefore of the financial institutions that are funding these activities. So because central banks and supervisors are taking care of the financial system, this creates then this connection from central banks and supervisors through the system to the environment. So this is the broad background. Today, this is an overview of the presentation that Uli and I will provide you with today. So first, I will talk a little bit about the main theoretical and analytical arguments for why there is even a need for intervention through financial policy that takes sustainability and broader environmental considerations into account. We'll talk about the financial stability arguments, mitigating risk through supervision and regulation, then briefly about the monetary policy implications when it comes to safeguarding inflation and aligning monetary policy instruments. And then finally, the big question of supporting the green transition and sustainability goals and the role of central banks and supervisors in financial policy in general in scaling up sustainable finance. Then I will hand over to Uli for him to explore the mandate dimension and how the central banks and supervisors are legally connected to the sustainability agenda. It's also a very important debate around the limits of what they can do, which is something that has come up this week very prominently in a series of articles by in The Economist. Maybe you've seen this. And then Uli will briefly speak about the emerging practice on the prudential, monetary, and framework side, and also talk about central bank portfolios. And finally, we will say a few words about where we are and what we think are the crucial or central future tasks and challenges for research and policy. So why is this relevant for central banks and supervisors, this whole sustainability agenda? Essentially, there are three key aspects of how climate change and environment factors into financial policy. And the approach taken here starts with these ultimate objectives of the relevant financial policy institutions, namely financial stability, monetary stability, and potentially the objective to support government policy, all of which are somehow affected by climate change and the environment. So financial stability, the idea is that environmental degradation is a threat to financial stability and economic prosperity. Then there is the problem of time horizons and the intertemporal tragedy of the commons. On monetary stability, the implications of climate change for environmental degradation and environmental degradation have implications for price stability. Physical damages as well as transition policies affect prices and need to be taken into account. And then there is the scaling up objective. So environmental degradation can be seen theoretically as an indicator of an environmentally unsustainable allocation of resources, which all of these arguments then create a rationale for some kind of intervention, or at least for the incorporation of these factors into policy frameworks. So financial and monetary stability are of course the established objectives of financial policy, which are affected by climate change in the environment. And the scaling up of green finance can be part of established objectives of central banks and maybe also supervisors, but it can also be seen as a new one. And Uli will talk about this in the mandate context a bit. So I will briefly go through these three main aspects in a little bit more detail. First, starting with financial stability. So there's of course the question of the financial stability implications of environmental factors and the related risks. In terms of definitions, we are building on the following here. So environmental sustainability challenges consist of all man-made environmental risks, And then environment-related risks refer to the risks posed by the exposure to activities that cause or are affected by environmental degradations and the actions to address these environmental challenges. And then climate risks, which have been the focus of research and prudential and monetary action, are essentially a subcategory of environmental risks, and so are biodiversity risks. There are different drivers, but the main category is essentially environmental risk. And it's important in this context to have this differentiation in mind between transition and physical risks. And it is also important to note in this context that that both the exposure to as well as action to address these challenges should be differentiated. So the risks essentially create negative externalities for the financial sector and the broader economy, which could be addressed through policy intervention in the form of financial regulation and supervision. These financial risks have a few distinct features that are important to highlight here. So some colleagues like to speak of radical uncertainty because it involves, environmental risks involve complex, nonlinear, and unpredictable dynamics, as well as chain reactions. Then there are so-called green swan risks, or essentially tail events that are potentially extremely financially disruptive events that could also trigger a systemic crisis or systemic financial instability. And well, all of this leads to a complex collective geopolitical action problem, especially on the systemic level. And maybe one more point. So a classical problem in environmental economics is, of course, the tragedy of the commons. And climate change has been described by Mark Carney as a tragedy of the horizon. And this creates a lot of challenges for policymakers, that policy essentially needs to play a role of addressing the lack of incentives by market participants to limit financial risks that will affect future market participants and society. And that is a main concern for supervisors in somehow bringing these future risks into the present and addressing them now. With this, this figure illustrates this transmission from environmental and climate-related risks all the way through the system through financial risks. And I mean, of course, financial institutions have direct exposure to environment and climate risks, but most of the exposure is indirect and stems from the exposure of their portfolios to these risks. On the left, you have the transition and physical risks. In the middle, you have these transmission channels through which these risks manifest then as financial risks on the right-hand side. Okay, so secondly, the monetary policy dimension and specifically the price stability implications of environmental degradation are central. So central banks have this primary role of safeguarding price stability, which is understood to then enable the economy to grow at an optimal rate. In the advanced economy context, monetary policy relies primarily on interest rate policy, and these operations are guided by complex economic modeling and forecasting efforts. And it's quite difficult to integrate environmental variables into these models, which is a current challenge. So what is important in this context of environmental degradation is the impact, of course, on the general price level, which in turn then affects monetary policy or the monetary policy of central banks that would attempt to somehow bring the price level to the optimal level. And in practice, both the physical damages as well as transition policies can have an impact on the general price level. So on the physical side, the increase in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events can affect the overall price level and the economy. And then on the transition side, there's a potential impact that environmental degradation and climate change mitigation policy may have on specific sectors or on energy production in general, and therefore on prices. So yeah, I mean, all these implications have to be incorporated into economic models and central bank policy analysis. And of course, they will also have a different impact on different monetary policy regimes, inflation targeting, monetary targeting. And we would argue, I think, to some degree that this can be, this can be addressed through the standard monetary policy instruments. So we are not really having a mandate discussion here. We are just having a discussion about understanding the implications for the core objective of central banks. Yes, so this, this figure gives a nice overview of some of the key variables that are understood to be affected by climate change. Climate change has been the starting point for central banks, and that are relevant for the conduct of monetary policy. And you also have some of the challenges here that this can present for the conduct of monetary policy. So this is, I would say, we are at a relatively early stage of research here, and colleagues just published a GRI working paper on integrating these variables, environmental variables, into macro models. And I think I think it's not fully understood yet. So, but overall, there are several challenges for monetary policy. For example, determining the nature of a price shock, whether it's permanent, temporary, so this is one aspect of the monetary policy implications of climate change. Apart from affecting the price level and inflation, there are also the implications for climate change based on how monetary policy instruments are implemented. And this is something Uli will speak about. So for example, whether they have an inherent carbon bias that creates an advantage for assets from carbon intensive firms and sectors. Certain monetary policy instruments can also be used to allocate credit into different sectors and to disincentivize banks from investing in, for example, carbon intensive sectors. That would then be a second aspect. And this essentially brings us to the third channel of how environmental factors affect financial policy, namely through this potential objective of scaling up green finance and investment to achieve a transition to a sustainable economy. Building on this differentiation between the impact on financial institutions and the impact of financial institutions, the question here is whether financial policy can be used to scale up sustainable investment and to green the financial system. Financial institutions are affected by environmental risks, and financial institutions affect the environment and the climate. So this little figure illustrates this point, that nature affects portfolios and portfolio choices affect nature. And in this context, sustainable finance policy can play the role of ensuring that financial flows and the system are greened, essentially. Yes, so the question is, why would sustainable finance policy intervene in the allocation of credit? I mean, first, very easy to achieve sustainable development objectives. So it can be a plain development objective to scale up investment that will have to be directed away from carbon and resource intensive and socially harmful activities into sustainable sectors and towards sustainable activities. So second, then there's of course also the economic argument. Central banks could do this to internalize the negative externalities, given that environmental degradation and biodiversity loss or climate change indicate an environmentally unsustainable and also socially suboptimal allocation of credit. So in the absence of public interventions, as we see, banks or other financial institutions allocate their resources to environmentally undesirable activities, in order to maximize their short-term private returns. And so this market failure argument again provides potentially an underlying rationale for intervention here. All of this, of course, is very much connected to the question of central bank mandates. While the financial and monetary stability objectives of central banks are very clear and well established, the scaling up narrative or the role that central banks and supervisors could potentially play in scaling up is very much subject to mandates. And with this, I will hand over to Uli.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thanks a lot for having us. Great pleasure to be with you. So the big question that especially when the discussion around central banks and climate change and sustainability and so on came up was is it within the mandate? So I personally started working on central banks and climate and sustainability more than a decade ago. And in those days, it was a very esoteric topic. It was not straightforward to a central banker that they should be working on climate issues. The response one would usually get is, yeah, it's really interesting, but it's not within our mandate. And this has been going on for a long time. And so Simon and I set out to write a paper on exactly this question. And if you could move to the next slide, please. We basically looked at mandates. So we created a database based on the IMF Central Legislation Database, and we collected mandates for 135 central banks. And then we just looked what the legal texts actually said. And so we identified mandates that either have an objective to enhance, promote, or support sustainability or sustainable development or sustainable growth, as well as mandates that support the government's economic objectives or policy goals. And those we characterized as having kind of central banks having an implicit mandate, because central banks that are supposed to support government's economic policies basically have an implicit mandate because now virtually all governments have signed up to the Paris Agreement and the Agenda 2030. So sustainability is a government objective, and the ones with an explicit mentioning of sustainability or sustainable development, sustainable growth, we say they have an explicit sustainability mandate. Next slide, please. And here you have the result. Out of the 175 central banks we looked at, 65 had no direct or indirect sustainability mandate, but 70, and that's of course the majority, actually did have one. So the majority of central banks has an explicit or implicit sustainability mandate. Next slide, please. And if you can click two more times, please. And so here you have the breakdown. Out of these central banks with a sustainability mandate, there are only 16, and you have the names of these central banks, or also there's one for a West African Monetary Union, not just for a country. 16 have an explicit central bank mandate, whereas the majority, so 54, have an implicit mandate. But this implicit mandate usually is subject to achieving the primary mandate, that usually is price stability or financial stability, or both. But the important point is that there are, in fact, a lot of central banks that have a sustainability mandate. Next slide, please. And of course, then a question is also, but what could central banks actually do? And as a matter of fact, that there are a lot of things that central banks can do. Here is a little high-level overview taken from the central banking or sustainable central banking toolbox that we put out a couple of years ago. As Simon mentioned, there are different monetary policy instruments that can be calibrated in a sustainability enhanced way, including collateral frameworks, reserve requirements, non-standard instruments such as asset purchase programs, but also direct monetary policy instruments, so kind of directed lending instruments. On the prudential side, there are various microprudential and macroprudential instruments that can be also used to address sustainability concerns. And then there are also further things central banks can do, for example, introducing financing schemes, managing their own portfolios in a sustainability aligned way, And of course, they can also play a greater role in developing sustainable finance frameworks for the economy. So there are a lot of things that central banks could be doing. Next slide, please. But that, of course, doesn't mean that central banks should be doing everything. And what's very important, different central banks have different instruments. Financial markets differ between countries. So it's very important to look at the specific context. What we are seeing is that some central banks, for example, use many more direct instruments to directly steer the market, whereas especially advanced country central banks tend to use more market-based instruments. But there really is a great importance to context. But let me just briefly outline some of the concerns that exist. First, on a functional level, central banks will have a problem if they are supposed to be active and have too few tools to achieve them. So economists call that, or refer to that problem as the Tinbergen rule. And one important point here is, of course, as I just mentioned, central banks have a potentially large number of tools. So adding extra objectives doesn't necessarily mean that you can't achieve them. But it is important to be clear about potential conflicts of interest. And for example, various sustainable finance enhancing instruments, lending schemes, green lending schemes, for example, they could be conflicting with stability, financial stability objectives. So green lending is not necessarily less risky, and therefore one has to be careful also from a financial stability perspective. But then again, if you use the right instruments, you don't necessarily need to create adverse side effects. One issue that has played a lot of, or has been very prominent in the discussion is the concern that there may be too much power vested in unaccountable institutions. So most central banks, of course not all, have a quite high degree of independence, and then having technocrats take all kinds of decisions that have very far-reaching consequences without really being politically accountable could be a problem. And this, of course, is also related to the concern that central banking may become politicized. And we've seen, especially since the global financial crisis, when in many countries central banks were kind of the last resort to roll out very powerful policies to kind of save the economy. They've taken on kind of a lot of responsibility. There's been a lot of criticism that they have gone beyond their mandate. And this has been a big discussion in the sustainability space as well. And one thing that central bankers are really fearing is that their job will become politicized. And there has been criticism of overstretching their mandates or kind of mission creep. Central bankers traditionally, at least over the last couple of decades, have been very much emphasizing the neutrality of central banking. But the reality, I would say, is that central banking has never been neutral. Any central banking decisions have great allocative impacts in our economies. So central banks can't really stay neutral. And specifically when we look at climate and sustainability risks, the problem is that markets have a very heavy carbon bias, for example, Nick Stern has famously described climate change as the greatest market failure ever. And I think that's a very good description. And the problem is, if central banks and supervisors really stay neutral in the face of this market failure, then they're basically perpetuating the market failure. So neutrality, I would argue, is not really an option. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of things that central banks could be doing. There are also concerns about, the limits of what they should be doing. But I think it's important to highlight in this context that no one is really asking central banks to single-handedly save the world. Central banks are very powerful institutions, but it's also clear that to address the climate and also kind of environmental and broader sustainability problems, we need an all-of-government approach, and there, of course, is a leading role for governments in addressing these problems. So central banks can't solve these problems by themselves. At the same time, it's absolutely crucial that they are actively involved and that they steer the financial sector, because the financial sector is at the very heart of the economy. And if we are not successful in aligning the financial system with sustainability goals, then we have zero chance of achieving any of these goals. And those institutions that govern finance, central banks and supervisors, really have to play an important role and complement other government policies to really facilitate and push the transition to climate neutral and sustainable economy. Next slide, please. Let me just quickly run through some developments regarding how sustainability has become or is in the process of becoming more mainstream in central banking. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of trends that are really taking over. So a lot of points are basically common sense now in the central banking community. Simon started off by explaining why central banks really should be addressing climate and other sustainability risks. And a couple of years ago, we had lots of discussion. Oh, is this really important? Does it matter? And are these all valid arguments? But this argument has been fully won. So there is now broadly a consensus that central banks, supervisors need to take these things seriously. And a couple of policy areas have emerged, which basically most central banks are now starting to work on. Importantly, and so I'll go through each of them. So disclosures, taxonomies, scenario analysis and climate stress testing, prudential frameworks, aligning central bank portfolios with sustainability, and then also increasingly there are central banks looking at monetary policy instruments. Next slide, please. So the first big area is disclosures. So there has been recognition that we have little transparency of climate risks and also other sustainability risks, and disclosures are, of course, a traditional way of addressing that. So basically asking organizations, and this involves both corporates and financial institutions, to create greater transparency of their climate risks. And the Financial Stability Board put forward in 2016 created a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which published its recommendations in 2017. And this has become the kind of gold standard for disclosures, and financial authorities, governments around the world have made this the basis of their disclosures. And there is now a growing chorus of senior central bankers, supervisors who say this kind of disclosure should be mandatory. The UK, for example, has already made climate-related financial disclosures mandatory, and many more financial authorities are going this direction. So that's a good start, creating greater transparency, creating more information on where risks may be lying. But of course, this can not be enough. Next slide, please. Another area that has received a lot of attention from policymakers is the creation of sustainable finance taxonomies. So if you talk about scaling up sustainable finance and also possibly taking policies to try to do that, we need to know what we're actually talking about. So creating taxonomies that define what is sustainable finance are important. And so China was the first country to create first a green bond taxonomy to define what activities can be classified as green, so they can be linked with green bonds. But this has been fleshed out in China and has gone really global and governmental. So as you can see in this map, there are a lot of countries, jurisdictions that either have already some sustainable finance taxonomy in place or are working on it. Maybe the most important one is the EU taxonomy, given that the EU is a very large economic zone, and all financial institutions who want to sell their products in the European Union have to use this taxonomy. And this also means that, for example, American financial institutions who want to sell financial products in the EU have also to comply with it. And China also has of course, taxonomy, and the EU and China have been working on creating a common ground taxonomy to have some kind of comparability. So taxonomies are important, but I would like to emphasize that most focus has been on sustainable or green taxonomies, but I would say that as important as this would be to have kind of dirty taxonomies, because we don't just need to have more investment in green, sustainable stuff, we also need to very rapidly phase out investment in dirty stuff. And so defining what is dirty is also important. And of course, kind of the extremes on both ends are relatively clear, but there's of course a lot of kind of middle ground where it becomes much more difficult. Next slide, please. One area that has received a lot of attention among central banks and supervisors is scenario analysis and climate stress testing. One of the difficulties, as Simon explained in the beginning, is that climate change and climate risk is very different. Also, nature risk is very different from traditional financial risk. We have to deal with tipping points. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the climate trajectories will be. An important tool to analyze these risks are scenario analysis and climate stress tests. So you build different scenarios, and these scenarios are not predictions, but they map out potential developments, and then you can use these scenarios to stress test your financial system, individual institutions, but also the financial system as a whole. And stress tests have become very common after the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And they are now adapted to the climate space. And also now we have already seen some scenario analysis and stress testing being developed for biodiversity risk. So that's also an important area. Next slide, please. So there's also a lot of discussion now about adjusting prudential frameworks, and not only in individual countries, but also kind of at the very center. So the Financial Stability Board has been discussing how to address climate-related financial risks. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has recently had a consultation on incorporating climate risk into banking supervision. These are all, still tentative steps, but we see a very clear direction. And given the speed at which central banks and supervisors usually operate, and it's not a very great speed, this has been breathtakingly quick. Just a couple of years ago, no one wanted to talk about it, and now we're already at a stage where adjusting some of the key prudential frameworks is seriously being discussed. Next slide, please. Central banks also often have large portfolios, policy portfolios, their own portfolios. Also often they manage portfolios for pension funds, governments, and so on. And this is now also an area where central banks have become very active. In 2017, actually, the Dutch central bank was the first to join the UN principle, UN PRI, so UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And there has been a lot of interest in central banks of how to align their non-policy portfolios with sustainability principles, and the NGFS has put forward some guidelines on that. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, there has been also very intensive discussion around adjusting monetary policy instruments to account for climate risk and also to support the scaling up of sustainable finance. And so Simon already mentioned some of these before. Collateral frameworks are a very powerful instrument. There are different indirect instruments such as differentiated reserve requirements, aligning refinancing operations, where a number of central banks, including the Japanese central bank, have been moving forward. There has been a lot of discussion around adjusting asset purchase programs. So empirical research has shown that quantitative easing programs in major economies have been very heavily carbon biased. So there's been discussion around adjusting that. And in various jurisdictions, including Bangladesh and China and India, central bank supervisors have been using direct instruments to allocate capital into desired sectors. And as I mentioned before, not everything is suitable for every central bank, but there's a quite broad range of instruments. So there's still a lot of discussion, what instruments should be used. Central banks tend to be cautious by nature, but we see a clear trend. Next slide, please. And sorry, I'm talking a little bit too long, but getting to the end now. So quickly on some of the frontiers. So as Simon mentioned before, and also referred to biodiversity and nature risk, there is now this recognition that this also is another major risk that needs to be addressed. Simon played a leading role in the recent NGFS Inspire study group, which brought together leading central bankers and researchers to look into the role of nature risk, and the NGFS's network of central banks and supervisors with now 114 members has, as a result of this report, recognized that this is really a major risk and that they need to address it. So this is going to be an important area. Next slide, please. One issue where I've also been working on quite a bit with Simon recently is the role of digital. You can't talk about financial markets in the year 2022 without looking at digital. So this has been a big disruptor. But digital finance can also play an important role in supporting the scaling up and mainstreaming of sustainable finance. Different big data-based approaches can address some of the information data problems that we have in analyzing risk. Also, supervisors can use artificial intelligence and automation to better assess climate risk. And then also digital finance can, for example, be a tool of scaling up what I call inclusive green finance. So specifically promoting financial services that support those at the base of the economic pyramid, so micro, small, medium enterprise and poorer households. And these are also parts of society that face significant climate and sustainability risks, and financial services, if they are well targeted, can support them. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, we have now arrived at a point where it's firmly established that central banks and supervisors need to address climate and sustainability risks. Central banks all over the world are trying to get their head around it. There's a lot of need for capacity building, so we're also very actively involved in that. So some trends are becoming very clear, but of course the devil's in the detail, and there's still some hesitancy. And for now, the focus has been very much on addressing risk, so mitigating climate risk in the financial sector. But there's now also increasingly discussion to go beyond that, because only addressing risk may not be, or is not enough, will not be enough to really align the financial system with sustainability, because many of the risks are more long-term, and so the financial risks are that supervisors deal with normally are rather short-term, and the financial sector has to be part and support the structural change of our economy to a more sustainable model. And so we need really an alignment of the financial system with the climate and sustainability goals. And this is now kind of a very pertinent issue where we're discussing with central banks and supervisors on how far they can go, how far they can push it. And with this, let me conclude. And sorry, we were talking, especially me, far too long. And I also have to apologize. I have to drop out at the end of the hour, but Simon will be there for another half hour. So if you have easy questions, you can give them to me in the next 10 minutes. And then the difficult ones, if you can please all give them to Simon afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you for that informative and enlightening presentation, Ulrich and Simon. And yes, we can take the questions from our participants fast, please, if you have. Bengisu Hocam, yes, you are raising your hands. If you are okay, you can go on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for both of the presentations. And my question is very much related with your last point, Uli. So I was going to ask actually, which kind of risks do you see will dominate in the medium to long term? Is it the physical risks? Is it the transition risks? Because what I can see from my side is that, you know, if the transition risks will dominate in the midterm, then it would also pose a risk towards, you know, adopting less ambitious climate policies. And you say that, you know, we have to go beyond, you know, risk assessment. So how do you see it? How can we actually see these risks in the midterm?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, first of all, of course, physical and transition risks are related. You know, the more ambitious the transition and the more successful we are in bringing down carbon emissions, the lesser the physical risk. But then again, even if we were to stop any emissions now, which of course won't happen, we still would face significant physical risk. And indeed, you know, we just have to look around. You know, on a daily basis, we have reports of climate catastrophes. I mean, right now, South Asia is boiling, and you know, kind of, and this is of course not only causing human suffering, but also causing enormous damages. So the physical risks are already there, and I think in the discussion, a lot of people underappreciate how serious the physical risks are now. It's not true that we just have this trade of transition risk now and physical risk later, but we have transition risk and physical risk now, and we need to deal with that. Then an important point is also that, of course, we have to look at each country, each region specifically. Yeah? So some countries are already now incredibly exposed to physical risk, whereas they may not be facing a lot of transition risk. Yeah? And then there are some countries which also in the future will not be as exposed to physical risk, but they may be exposed very much to transition risk, and some have really both. And you know, if you look at, say, Nigeria, you know, kind of an entirely oil-based economy, so they have huge transition risk, but they also have huge physical risk. So one has to look very carefully. Or if you take Indonesia again, physically extremely exposed, like the rest of Southeast Asia, but Indonesia is the biggest exporter of oil. Of coal. Big transition risk there. But the problem that you point out, kind of the reluctance to address transition risk, is an important one. And I would say that we still haven't got the narrative right. Yeah? So the notion is still that, okay, taking climate action is very costly. And of course, there are costs involved. Structural transformations do involve a lot of cost. But we also have to look at the opportunities, and of course also what's the relationship between the cost and the opportunities. So I think the economic rationale for being much more assertive on climate risk is very strong, but the narrative is really not there.
Maybe to add one point, just to make it a little bit, well, to make it even more complicated. I mean, yes, the NGFS scenarios are, of course, attempting to model exactly that, and to assess under different transition pathways how transition risks would occur, and whether this would be a short-term, a medium, or long-term risk. And for example, I guess under a net zero by 2050 scenario, where it would be a smooth transition from now until 2050, this would be an optimal transition pathway in terms of mitigating, and in terms of having low transition risks and avoiding very severe physical risks from having missed to transition to net zero emissions. However, there are of course also other net zero by 2050 transition pathways. For example, a delayed transition, which has very different physical and transition risk implications, because then all of a sudden, after I think 2035 is the cutoff under this NGFS scenario, the entire industry would have to transition very quickly, potentially stranding a lot of assets. And maybe to add even one more point, there are, of course, then also green risks. So the question is, what are the implications of scaling up specific technologies? This maybe also relates to this whole discussion of critical minerals, which is something that we now see in the FT every day, the minerals needed for renewable energy technologies, for batteries. So there are a lot of transition risk factors and uncertainties relating to different transition pathways then also. And as Uli said, it's then also different from country to country.
Thank you. I see the Ahmet Atıl Aşıcı hocam. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Uli, for this very informative presentations. I have a very, practical question. It's about Bitcoin. We know that Bitcoin, the producing of Bitcoin consume a lot of energy, including fossil fuels, like generated from fossil fuels. Do you think that central bank should have a say on this issue on the grounds that, this Bitcoin is a financial instrument, but at the same time, it might have like huge environmental, consequences. So we are going to ban it, regulate it, limit it. What is the state of discussion on this issue? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, first I can give you my personal view, which is very clear on that. So I would definitely be very tough on Bitcoin. I think it adds nothing in terms of social value. You mentioned, of course, all the environmental problems, so that probably would be enough to just, shut it down. But then it also, Bitcoin, it's a speculative financial asset that by itself, you could maybe live with, but the problem is that, of course, that is also very heavily used for illicit finances, and so I think it's very problematic. I think it should be shut down or heavily regulated, so just today there was the announcement that the Central African Republic, I think, made it legal tender. I think this is absolutely the wrong way. Having said that, there is now a very important discussion moving ahead quite quickly in the central banking community about digital central banking currencies. And I think this is a positive development, and I think there is actually a need for central banks to move in this direction to provide an alternative. So cryptocurrencies per se are not the problem. I think they will become part of the future, but part of a regulated future. And of course, there are a lot of libertarians who think Bitcoin, is the future. And I recently read someone writing that, if we're now seeing hyperinflation in the US, then finally we can get over the dollar-centered global financial system, and Bitcoin will finally provide a stable financial system. And I was like, God, but anyway, I shouldn't go on a rant. In fact, I need to go into another meeting, which unfortunately had been scheduled beforehand, and I can't skip. But Simon will be here, and he will have much better answers than me anyway. But it's been a great pleasure to be with you, and maybe see you one day in real. So thank you very much.
I hope. Thank you so much, Uli. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Uli.
We can continue with the Sevil Acar Aytekin hocam. After that, we can continue with the Ezgi Berfin Ünsal hocam. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, both to Uli and Simon. So I think I have a problem with this. I'm far from the topic, but I have a problem with the green finance concept, because on the part of the central banks, I understand that the transition can be facilitated by the proliferation of all these green financial instruments, derivatives, etc., all these green bonds and green loans, whatever. But on the other hand, it has been also seen that most of the money or most of the proceeds from these green bonds are going to the same, usual suspect sectors like energy, like construction, transport. That's on one side. And on the other side, also, they are being criticized for being another form of greenwashing or for raising capital investments that have, in fact, minimal positive climate impacts. We know them from the investments in hydropower plants and how they were co-financed by green bonds, etc. So what do you think about this kind of a system, apart from transitional risks that you have mentioned in detail? How to really see a climate sensitive impact is, and a real impact is being done in especially climate sensitive investments. Could you a little bit comment on that?
Yes, and I think I fully agree with you, definitely. No, I mean, absolutely. I guess the issue is that you have a financial sector that is not necessarily interested in bringing about a transition, which is, of course, a goal of government policy and of the Paris Agreement. But the financial sector itself is not necessarily interested in, well, first of all, mitigating the risks, which are potentially outside of the business cycle. At least that's something they would argue. And they are also not interested, in being the first, for example, to change their portfolio allocation while competing with US banks. I mean, the crucial point here is the question of the taxonomy. So a good taxonomy should address exactly these kind of issues, because it should be designed by the government to define the activities, to define green activities, and to define unsustainable activities. And that is essentially a way of translating government policy and the vision that you have to achieve net zero by 2050 into financial sector assets and lending. So this is why taxonomy is so crucial, because you need to define what the word green means. And the financial sector can't really define this, because it has to be aligned with what the government defines as the transition pathway. Which industries will have to disappear, which ones will have to be transformed, and which ones will have to be scaled up. So that is the role of the taxonomy. The problem there, of course, is when a taxonomy is designed by the financial sector, which has been to some degree the case in the EU. And therefore, it also only focused on the green aspects. Uli mentioned this briefly. From a central banking or risk-based point of view, you are especially interested in those activities and sectors that are not sustainable. So that is something that is being, I think, addressed in Indonesia. I guess in a highly financialized, market-based financial system, this is a tricky task. An interesting example is China, where the People's Bank of China developed a taxonomy defining these sectors very early on, and then also essentially I guess the People's Bank of China to some degree is engaged in industrial policy and is asking the banking sector to allocate their lending to certain industries and not to others, which is something that would be outside of the scope of the European Central Bank. But I guess generally the taxonomy should play this role of defining what kind of sectors need investment and to which sectors investment should be reduced. In terms of the proceeds going to carbon intensive sectors or of green bonds, that is an interesting point. And the taxonomy, the European taxonomy, is not operating on the sectoral level, but it's operating on the activity level. So the idea is that BP or Shell should be able to raise funds to fund green projects. Because I think it is unrealistic to assume that all these big energy companies will disappear within the next 15 years and that new companies will just appear. So I guess it is about financing the transition within these companies. And yes, and an activity-based taxonomy enables you as Shell or big oil company to fund very specific activities through green bonds. And these are hopefully defined in a very accurate and good way by the government. So yeah, that is the main tool to combat greenwashing, essentially, in the EU and in China.
Please, Ezgi Hocam, you can ask your question.
Yes. Okay, hello. I also want to thank you both. I'm also very happy to see you, Simon, here after our days at SOAS. Yeah, very happy. So yeah, in the beginning of the presentation, you actually said it. You said that you're not having a discussion on the mandate. So my question is on that actually. It's a kind of theoretical question. Yeah, you were just suggesting, without discussing the mandates, without discussing the theoretical framework that actually designed those mandates, you were just looking for ways of incorporating all these climate relevant objectives into the central banking framework. But I mean, if it was up to you, I mean, if you were to choose between different mandates or between different theoretical understandings of designing those mandates, do you think there is a I mean, do you think there are differences between different theoretical understandings in terms of incorporating, or do you think they can all be incorporated equally into different ways of understanding those? Yeah, so I was wondering.
Yeah, that is a nice question, Ezgi. Also because it relates to the topic of my PhD at SOAS, which was on the history of central banking and essentially the industrial policy role a lot of central banks have played in the past and continue to play in emerging markets today. So when we talk about this, I mean, yeah, when we talk about mandates, I guess the implications for price and financial stability, this is something that just needs to be understood in order for central banks to be able to achieve their core mandates. When it comes to this more promotional side, what is interesting that in the past, in response to huge economic crises or big changes in economic theory, central banks always changed their approach. I mean, for example, if we think about the Second World War and the role that central banks all of a sudden played in Europe, for example, in really engaging in industrial policy. Bank of England, Banque de France, all of them played a heavy role in the 60s, 70s, up until the 80s. So did the Bank of Japan, in essentially directing lending and making sure that economies would be rebuilt in an effective way. So I guess to some degree the question is whether climate change or environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, whatever the metric is recognized as such an emergency. And once it is, I think the mandate question will be secondary. Because if it becomes clear that climate change will have huge, or once it's realized that global warming to above 3 degrees will have huge impacts on the economy, I think an emergency will be recognized and central banks would change their approach. I mean, in response to COVID and the economic lockdown, central banks were also quite quick to adjust their framings and to then also allocate credit. I think we even saw a few European central banks making sure that the banking sector can still fund the tourism industry in an effective way. So again, it was a crisis. No one was concerned about the mandate, it was a lesser concern, and policies were rolled out. And I guess with 2008 and the financial crisis, and then the addition of the financial stability objective, it was a similar role. So I think the mandate question is, I guess the core mandates, it's clear, but this promotional role, which is a role that a lot of emerging market central banks still play, is something that will become relevant for all central banks once it's recognized as a big emergency.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Erinç Hocam, you are in the line now. Please go ahead.
Simon, many thanks. You have partially answered actually what I was purporting to ask. It's a very practical question, and I am in 100% agreement with you, and so are many colleagues over here. But to play the devil's advocate, the reaction of many colleagues from both the Turkish Central Bank and from others is a very stubborn one, saying that, yes, climate crisis is a risk, but our mandate is you have put you have followed mostly on the sustainability issue, but the mandate conservatively is a very narrow one, price stability. And allocation of credit across brown versus green sectors is not the role of the central bank. It's the banking supervisory agency, some other form of regulation. And whatever we do, besides the following up the price stability objective, will be liquidating, and as Uli quite nicely narrated the list of risks, liquidating, politicizing, creating confusion of our price stability objective. And nobody wants to hear anything but price stability objective, and all others should be responsible of someone else. How shall we deal with this kind of, I should say, conservative stubbornness? I hear you, but I just couldn't help myself to say this aloud once again.
No, and that is so. No, this is a very good question, because I mean, we see this. I mean, I would say this is the dominant response, and I think I would also agree to some degree with this response by central banks with a narrow mandate that they say, well, yes, there are price stability implications. Happy to assess and address them, but everything beyond this is not clearly within our mandate. And I mean, this is also the approach by a lot of European, or I guess by all European central banks. Two interesting examples are there: the Bank of England and the European Central Bank. So the Bank of England has a primary mandate to safeguard price stability. Also now a financial stability mandate through its PRA, but the Bank of England also has a secondary mandate to support the economic policies of the government. And the government sends a remit letter every year to the Bank of England in March or so, outlining what these economic priorities are. And I mean, we started discussing this with the Bank of England, I think in 2016, 15, 16, 17, something like this. And the response was always, on a lot of these topics, well, it's not clear whether it's within our mandate, we can't do anything. And then last March 2021, I believe it was, the Treasury, which is the institution that is sending this remit letter to the Bank of England, included the net zero transition by 2050 in this letter for the first time, in the monetary policy remit letter. And all of a sudden, the Bank of England felt very comfortable, was at least my assessment, to discuss the implications of the net zero transition for its mandate and for its operations, specifically, for example, for its asset purchase program, which had a proven or has a proven carbon bias. So they started a consultation and started discussing the implications for monetary policy. So sometimes it is this kind of signal from the Treasury that is needed to define, clarify the mandate and say, well, it is within your mandate. Please do something about it. The ECB is interesting because the ECB also has the secondary mandate to support the economic policies of the European Union. And so this is also in this article in The Economist that I mentioned, where the professor from Princeton is saying, well, this secondary mandate, yes, that could be a way in. If the Parliament or the Commission, well, I guess it's the Parliament, would clarify this role. However, important, I guess this is super early stage for advanced economy central banks. However, all of them have been very active in doing a lot of things. So it's not something that really is an excuse for inaction, because on the risk side, on the monetary, on the price stability side, there is so much that needs to be done to understand the risks and implications that, yes, allocating credit or intervening in this or not is really just, I would say, a late stage policy instrument that could be discussed and might not be necessary. I mean, the Federal Reserve is also an interesting example there, because the Federal Reserve, of course, is struggling with to find this kind of policy space to really engage in this debate. I mean, they established these two committees, the SEC and the SEC and FCC. One on the micro, one on the macroprudential part. But yes, I mean, you don't have a vocal governor at the bank, at the Federal Reserve, that is providing the kind of policy space and also, I guess, space of thought for staff to do research, which is something that you have super prominently at the European Central Bank, with initially Frank Elderson, who was chair of the NGFS and then joined the executive board, Isabel Schnabel, economics professor from Bonn, who was very conservative in the beginning, but came around and is starting to discussing all of this. And then, of course, Christine Lagarde was a major point there. An interesting observation is that often you have these high-level board members talking about climate change, and then you have rather small climate change hubs within the central bank that are doing research and are discussing how to implement or how to integrate the implications into different policy remits. And then I guess the big divisions like monetary and financial stability are sometimes not really deeply included in this. So this is also an interesting dynamic that we observe, I think.
I think there is no one to ask something now. Bahar Özay hocam, please go ahead, ask your question.
Actually, I would like to hear more.
Your microphone is not working, I think.
Can you hear right now?
Now it's okay.
Okay. I'm not so much satisfied with the answer of Simon because, we have, as Uri also said, we need a narrative, and we should show the importance of what is the benefit of making this is so important for the central banks, because the model that you have put, it's really perhaps working for United Kingdom or for European Central Bank. But for Turkey, it is really, really difficult. I understand your explanation for the mandate, but it's really impossible, almost impossible, even to change, to think about the regulation. So where to start? What to show? What are the exact figures? Because sometimes, I think yesterday, we have spoken with a big businessman, and he was saying that we are not fearing of climate threats, but we are only fearing of the competition risk, or just kind of a survival. So, just relating to Uli's narration framing, do you suggest kind of tools, or are you using this, and how you are showing the how do you say, concrete results of this greening central banking? I hope to be much more, I expect much more clear answers and tools from your side, Simon. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is a problem that everyone faced in the beginning. That there was, I mean, on the natural science side, it became increasingly clear that climate change is happening and that there will be catastrophic implications for all economies, either through physical risks if we don't manage to achieve a transition, or then also transition pathways will have also different implications. So I guess and this is where this biodiversity project that we just conducted together with the NGFS over the last year is interesting. That, I mean, biodiversity loss is essentially a second. Well, I mean, biodiversity, climate change, it's all very much connected, and biodiversity loss is a main driver of climate change, and climate change is the main driver of biodiversity loss. So it doesn't really make sense to look at them differently. But for the NGFS, having only always looked, or primarily looked at climate change, it was a new dimension. So we had to start essentially from scratch, convincing anyone within the central banking community that this is relevant and that this somehow relates to their activities. And
point, perhaps you can answer to that as well. When there is a big problem for the conventional management of this big finance world in terms of central banking, when they have very, very big problems with the conventional central banking. How this is a kind of a luxury thing. Can you? I hope that I explained.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. I mean, and so we essentially had to start again from scratch, trying to build the case, and how we did this, and a few colleagues, was through very basic research that outlined what is the actual exposure of the financial system. So again, and this is also how the climate change debate started, that it just started with research translating the natural science bit into very clear implications for the financial system. So on the biodiversity side, there were I think four or five studies done in the last year outlining how the French financial system is exposed to biodiversity loss and how dependent is it. So I think the French study found that 43% of the French financial system is highly dependent on ecosystem services, meaning that were they to collapse, the financial system would not collapse, but it would have huge implications. So the basic research to make the case can be very powerful, is our experience. That translating the natural science into the financial implications is a very powerful starting point to then build the case for the specific policy implications. But I think this is something that could also be relevant in the context of Turkey, is to really make clear, okay, what are the financial stability implications? And interestingly, financial stability has always been the starting point, because I mean, it is the starting point for the Federal Reserve. It has been the starting point for the European central banks, and it's within the mandate. It's not very controversial. It's really just about understanding what is going on. Once this foundation is built, then it's easier to start talking about, okay, what are the implications? We recognize the risk is there, the sector is affected, we should respond to this. And then I guess it would start through, what can the sector do, what can the central bank do, and what are the specific policy frameworks where this is relevant. What is interesting in the emerging market context is, I think that we see a few central banks that started the other way around, that realized there is a vulnerability, climate change is affecting the economy, and that then started to support specific initiatives and to somehow direct credit or incentivize credit that would go into adaptation or mitigation projects. So that is, I guess, more a top-down approach, where you as the supervisor realize, okay, we are vulnerable, we will be affected, we need to mitigate this already. And I think to some degree, this is an approach the People's Bank of China picked, which is a central bank that started very early to somehow realize that there is potentially an economic growth, sustainability trade-off, and to then, when growth accelerated very quickly, well above 7%, that this came at the cost of also environmental degradation, leading it to implement some kind of environmental rules for banks and financial institutions. So I guess these are the two approaches, that the case making and providing the empirical foundation has been the starting point, and through the financial stability lens has been the starting point for European central banks, I think, and a lot of advanced economy central banks, including the Bank of England. But then, well, maybe an important point there is in the emerging market context is that often an easy way in is to look for existing policies that already are somehow promoting some kind of sector. And this has been, for example, the case in India, in Bangladesh, in China, and in Japan, an advanced economy example, where you had existing policies by the central bank directing or incentivizing banks to lend to certain sectors, to which they then added a green component. So that is also an interesting argument, especially if the government commits to net zero through a net zero law, to then say, well, you have these policies in place that support the government priorities. Why not add a component that makes that, or a calibration that ensures that it's done in a sustainable way? Bank of Japan is really quite interesting, because the Bank of Japan has this preferential refinancing line for economic priority sectors, which they are just about to align with a green narrative. And it's a long existing program, and the same is the case for the refinancing program in China, which always existed, And at some point, the People's Bank added a green component following government guidance on this. I hope this helps.
Thank you.
By the way, we are in the last 2 minutes. Ezgi Berfin Ünsal hocam, please go ahead for your last question, please.
It won't take long because it was partially answered by Simon anyway. So I was going to say, Simon, you already mentioned in your taxonomy there are some emerging economies which are trying to incorporate this kind of objectives into their, central banking framework. So when maybe when we are just focusing on sustainable finance, we're always focusing on advanced economies, EU, the United States, but maybe sometimes we're not really seeing what the other emerging economies such as China is doing, which you said was one of the first countries to implement them. I mean, so they are just equally devoted to fast growth and also maybe towards sustainable finance as well. So maybe maybe these could be the paths for Turkey as well to look at.
Good point. And just in 1 minute, this was my starting point. My first paper was on sustainable central banking in emerging and developing economies, because back in 2017, it looked like these countries were actually leading. So this was before the NGFS was established and before the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and all of these advanced economy central banks got involved. Before that happened, we already saw actual policy action in emerging markets. So that was definitely the case. And the Central Bank of Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India. Well, India was, I think, 2015 when they added renewable energy. But that was definitely very interesting. And I think some of this, and this is often, or this was often, or is often, action on the monetary policy side, which is something that I think a lot of advanced economies have not been engaged in so far, especially not in the European context. So if we look for real action on aligning financial flows, there is a lot to look at if you have a look at emerging markets. And Bangladesh specifically was a central bank that announced green refinancing lines. I think 4 or 5 programs, one after the other, starting in, I don't know, in 2016 or 15 already. So very early on, and China has definitely been a champion. I mean, China then also, when growth dropped below 7% in, I think, 2015, became very aware of this potential trade-off between cheap energy, for example, coal-powered energy generation, and sustainability objectives. So that is then also a difficult topic to generally the growth, the fast, dirty growth, and the sustainable growth trade-off. But China navigated this in a very interesting way, I think. So yes, Eski, good point. No, I guess the European agenda is very much based on the assessment and understanding of implications. It's based on this approach. And in emerging markets, we actually see a lot of action already. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. I don't see anyone who raises the hand right now, and we have also filled our time. So I guess we can finish today's conference. So I just want to thank you to all our presenters today, Uri and Simon, to you, and also thank you for attending this seminar, dear participants. Many thanks again for accepting our invitation. So I would like to give the floor to our project coordinator, Professor Erinçer'den, for the finished speech, I think. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Nothing much to add, really, Simon. On behalf of everyone, we are happy, proud to be able to host you. And we do, in fact, are looking forward to host you in person in Istanbul. That will be our pleasure. Many thanks for it.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, please stay in touch. Happy to continue this discussion in one way or another. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Definitely.
Thank you.
So long.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.